Utilitarianism claims that morality reduces to a single calculable question about consequences. This ethical framework evaluates actions by measuring their capacity to generate well-being or suffering. The theory proposes that right action maximizes total happiness across all affected beings. No action possesses inherent moral value independent of the outcomes it produces in the world. This means killing can be right if it prevents greater harm. Lying becomes permissible when truth would cause net suffering. Every choice demands calculation of pleasure against pain across every affected consciousness. The philosophy emerged during the 18th and 19th centuries as Enlightenment thinkers sought secular foundations for ethics. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill developed systematic theories grounding morality in observable human experience. They rejected religious authority and abstract metaphysical claims about goodness. Instead, they proposed that pleasure and pain constitute the only phenomena with intrinsic value. This hedonistic foundation makes utilitarianism empirically testable through observation of human preferences and suffering. The theory's influence extends far beyond academic philosophy into economics, public policy, and medical ethics. Cost-benefit analysis in government derives directly from utilitarian cost-benefit calculation of aggregate welfare. Effective altruism movements prioritize interventions that maximize lives saved per dollar spent. Yet utilitarianism faces profound challenges regarding personal integrity, justice, and the commensurability of human values. Understanding this philosophy requires examining its logical foundations, historical evolution, and the devastating critiques it has weathered. Part 1. The Foundational Architecture. Utilitarianism belongs to the broader family of consequentialist theories in normative ethics. Consequentialism asserts that moral properties depend entirely on the consequences actions produce. An action's rightness or wrongness flows exclusively from the states of affairs it brings about. This stands opposed to deontological theories that identify intrinsically right or wrong action types. Killing an innocent person might be absolutely forbidden under deontology, regardless of beneficial outcomes. Consequentialism rejects such absolute prohibitions as irrational constraints on maximizing good. Within consequentialism, utilitarianism makes three specific commitments that define its distinctive character. First, it embraces welfarism, which holds that only welfare or well-being possesses intrinsic value. Other goods like knowledge, beauty, or justice matter only insofar as they contribute to welfare. Second, utilitarianism demands aggregation of welfare across all affected individuals without preferential weighting. Your suffering counts exactly as much as mine in the moral calculation. Third, classical utilitarianism endorses hedonism, equating welfare with pleasure and absence of pain. These commitments generate a deceptively simple decision procedure for determining right action. Calculate the total pleasure minus pain that each possible action would produce. Count every sentient being's welfare equally without regard to identity or relationship. Choose the action yielding the highest net total of pleasure over pain. This calculation must extend across all affected parties throughout time. The rightness of bombing a city depends on summing pleasure and pain for everyone it impacts. Jeremy Bentham formalized this decision procedure in 1789 through his hedonic calculus. Bentham proposed 7 dimensions for measuring any pleasure or pain an action might generate. Intensity measures the strength of the pleasure or pain experienced. Duration captures how long the sensation persists after the action occurs. Certainty evaluates the probability that the predicted pleasure or pain actually materializes. Propinquity concerns temporal and spatial proximity of the pleasure or pain to the action. Fecundity assesses whether a pleasure tends to generate additional future pleasures. Purity measures whether a pleasure comes mixed with pain, or vice versa. Extent counts the number of sentient beings affected by the pleasure or pain. Bentham envisioned reducing moral questions to mathematical calculation along these 7 axes. The calculus reveals utilitarianism's radical egalitarian implications regarding the moral status of beings. Bentham extended moral consideration to all creatures capable of experiencing pleasure and suffering. He argued that the question is not whether animals can reason or talk. The only relevant question is whether they can suffer. This positioned utilitarianism centuries ahead of its time on animal welfare issues. If a dog's pain counts equally with human pain of equivalent intensity and duration, factory farming becomes atrocious. Yet Bentham's quantitative hedonism faces an immediate objection regarding the quality of different pleasures. If only quantity matters, then identical amounts of pleasure from pushpin equal pleasure from poetry. Spending an evening drinking beer while watching television could maximize utility better than reading Shakespeare. Many find this conclusion absurd and degrading to human nature. It suggests no moral difference exists between lives of sophisticated cultural achievement and base sensual indulgence. John Stuart Mill attempted to refine Bentham's framework by introducing qualitative distinctions among pleasures. Mill argued that some pleasures possess superior quality independent of their mere quantity or intensity. He claimed pleasures engaging distinctively human faculties rank higher than purely animalistic satisfactions. Intellectual pleasures from philosophy or art outweigh bodily pleasures from food or sex. A human being dissatisfied exceeds a pig, satisfied in terms of genuine welfare. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Mill proposed a test for determining which pleasures possess higher quality than others. Consult competent judges who have experienced both types of pleasure being compared. If all or most such judges prefer one pleasure even knowing it brings discontent, that pleasure has superior quality. This preference must persist even when the lower pleasure exceeds the higher in quantity. People who have tasted both intellectual pursuits and mindless entertainment consistently prefer the former. This qualitative modification generates severe theoretical problems that Mill never adequately resolved. First, it threatens to collapse utilitarianism into a different theory entirely. If higher pleasures lexically dominate lower pleasures, quantity becomes irrelevant to moral calculation. Any amount of higher pleasure outweighs any amount of lower pleasure. This abandons the commensurability that makes utilitarian calculation possible in practice. Second, Mill's competent judge criterion embeds troubling elitist assumptions about whose preferences count. Those who appreciate classical music qualify as competent judges regarding aesthetic pleasure. Those who prefer popular entertainment allegedly lack competence to judge because they haven't cultivated refined tastes. This creates a hierarchy where educated elites determine which pleasures genuinely contribute to welfare. The working classes pursuing simple pleasures face condescending dismissal of their life choices. Third, empirical evidence contradicts Mill's confident assertion that competent judges universally prefer higher pleasures. Many highly educated people with access to intellectual pursuits choose television over philosophy. They make this choice knowing both options and understanding the discontent intellectual life can bring. Mill attributes such choices to weakness of character or insufficient appreciation of the higher pleasure. But this makes the theory unfalsifiable by converting counterexamples into evidence of character defects. The deeper issue concerns whether hedonism itself can ground utilitarianism regardless of qualitative distinctions. Philosopher Robert Nozick's experience machine thought experiment devastates pure hedonistic theories. Imagine a machine that stimulates your brain to produce any experience you desire. You could live believing you're writing great novels or climbing Everest while actually lying motionless in a tank. The machine guarantees maximum pleasure with zero pain throughout your entire life. Would you plug in permanently? Most people strongly prefer living actual lives with genuine achievements over maximum hedonic experience. This suggests welfare involves more than subjective mental states of pleasure and pain. We care about actually writing the novel, not merely experiencing the sensation of having written it. We value authentic relationships with real people over simulated interactions with idealized companions. Our welfare seems to require objective engagement with reality beyond mere phenomenology. Modern utilitarians often abandon hedonism in favor of preference satisfaction or objective list theories. Preference utilitarianism defines welfare as satisfying whatever preferences individuals actually hold. This accommodates the experience machine intuition, since most people prefer not plugging in. But preference theories face their own severe difficulties with adaptive preferences and offensive tastes. Should satisfying a sadist's preference for torture count toward aggregate utility? What about preferences formed under oppression that rationalize one's subordination? Objective list theories propose that certain goods constitute welfare independent of hedonic experience or preference. Knowledge, friendship, achievement, and autonomy might possess intrinsic value beyond their pleasant phenomenology. This approach better captures our intuitions about what makes life go well for people. Yet it sacrifices the elegant empirical foundation that made classical utilitarianism attractive. How do we determine which goods belong on the objective list without appealing to contested metaphysics? These foundational debates about the nature of welfare remain unresolved within contemporary utilitarian theory. The challenge becomes specifying what we're supposed to maximize before we can calculate right action. Different theories of welfare generate radically different moral conclusions in concrete cases. Preference utilitarianism might permit harvesting organs from one person to save 5 who prefer survival. Hedonism might prohibit this if the victim's terror causes more pain than saved lives produce pleasure. Without a stable account of welfare, utilitarianism loses its claim to providing determinate moral guidance. The aggregation requirement creates additional theoretical difficulties independent of which welfare theory we adopt. Utilitarianism demands impartial summation of welfare across all affected individuals with equal weight. This generates implications that clash violently with common-sense moral intuitions about justice and rights. Total utilitarianism says we should increase population as long as average welfare remains positive. Adding billions of people with barely tolerable lives could maximize total utility. This repugnant conclusion suggests our theory has gone badly wrong. Average utilitarianism tries to avoid the repugnant conclusion by maximizing average rather than total welfare. But this creates even more bizarre implications regarding population ethics and moral obligations. Average utilitarianism might require killing happy people if doing so raises average welfare among survivors. It makes creating miserable people worse than creating no one, yet permits creating people destined for mediocrity. The theory also struggles to accommodate separateness of persons as morally significant. Utilitarianism treats individuals as mere vessels for welfare without inherent normative significance. It permits sacrificing some people's fundamental interests to slightly benefit many others. One person might be tortured to generate modest pleasure for millions watching on television. The aggregate calculation cares only about total welfare, not how it distributes across distinct lives. This violates our deep conviction that each person possesses inviolable rights against being used instrumentally. Part 2. Act versus Rule Utilitarianism. The distinction between act and rule utilitarianism represents the most fundamental structural division within the theory. Act utilitarianism evaluates individual actions directly by their consequences in each particular situation. You calculate the utility produced by each available action and choose the one maximizing total welfare. Every moral decision requires fresh calculation of expected consequences across all affected parties. No general rules constrain what actions might prove right in unusual circumstances. Rule utilitarianism evaluates actions indirectly by reference to rules that generally maximize utility. The theory first identifies which rules would produce best consequences if generally followed. Then it judges individual actions by conformity to those utility-maximizing rules. You don't calculate consequences for each action, but rather follow rules justified by their consequences. Promise-keeping might be such a rule because societies function better when promises get kept. This distinction emerged sharply in the 1950s when Richard Brandt introduced the terminology. Earlier, utilitarians like Bentham and Mill applied their principle inconsistently to both acts and rules. This created scholarly confusion about what the classical utilitarians actually endorsed. Mill sometimes appeals to secondary principles that look like rule utilitarianism. But he also discusses cases where direct appeal to utility principle overrides such secondary rules. Act utilitarianism faces devastating objections regarding counterintuitive implications in specific cases. Consider a scenario where you could secretly kill one healthy patient to harvest organs for 5 dying patients. Act utilitarianism appears to endorse this murder because 5 lives outweigh 1 life. The victims die either way, so total deaths remain constant across both options. But saving 5 produces vastly more future utility than saving 1. Therefore, killing the healthy patient maximizes utility and becomes morally required. Most people find this conclusion morally abhorrent and reject any theory implying it. We believe the doctor violates profound moral constraints by murdering an innocent person. Even if harvesting organs would produce better consequences, the act remains deeply wrong. This suggests moral evaluation depends on factors beyond mere aggregate consequences. The distinction between killing and letting die carries moral weight that act utilitarianism cannot accommodate. Similar problems arise with promise-keeping, truth-telling, and other common-sense moral obligations. Act utilitarianism permits breaking promises whenever doing so would produce marginally better consequences. You promise to meet a friend for lunch, but encounter someone needing minor assistance. Helping this person produces slightly more utility than keeping your lunch appointment. Act utilitarianism requires breaking the promise, yet this seems to devalue personal commitments. Rule utilitarianism attempts to avoid these counterintuitive implications by operating at the level of rules. A rule against killing innocent people would maximize utility if universally followed. Societies where doctors harvest organs from unwilling patients would collapse in terror and distrust. Nobody would seek medical care if hospitals might murder them for spare parts. Therefore, the utility-maximizing rule prohibits killing innocents even when individual violations would produce good consequences. This maneuver appears to vindicate common-sense morality while retaining utilitarian foundations. Promise-keeping rules maximize utility because social cooperation depends on keeping commitments. Truth-telling rules maximize utility because communication systems require general honesty. Rule utilitarianism generates the same prohibitions as ordinary morality, but justifies them through consequences. However, rule utilitarianism faces severe theoretical difficulties that threaten to undermine the entire approach. The most devastating is the collapse problem, which shows rule utilitarianism collapsing into act utilitarianism. Consider what happens when we formulate rules with increasing specificity and qualification. Start with a simple rule that one should never lie. But lying to save innocent lives from murderers produces better consequences than rigid honesty. So we revise the rule to permit lying when lives are at stake. Yet even this qualified rule proves too rigid for maximizing utility in all circumstances. What about lying to spare someone's feelings when truth serves no important purpose? We add another exception to the rule permitting harmless lies. But now we need exceptions for lies that prevent significant harm, lies that protect privacy, and so forth. Each exception makes the rule more complex, but better at maximizing utility. The logical endpoint is a rule so qualified and specific that it applies to only one situation. At that point, rule utilitarianism becomes functionally identical to act utilitarianism. We've simply renamed act utilitarian calculation as following extremely specific rules. The entire apparatus of rules collapses into direct evaluation of individual action consequences. Rule utilitarianism saved common-sense morality only by preventing itself from truly maximizing utility. Rule utilitarians respond by restricting rule formulation to general principles without excessive qualification. But this response proves arbitrary and unprincipled from within utilitarian theory itself. Why should utilitarian theory endorse simple general rules when complex specific rules would maximize utility better? The commitment to generality comes from outside utilitarian foundations. It reflects deontological intuitions about moral rules rather than consequentialist reasoning. Another difficulty concerns what counts as general acceptance of a rule for evaluating consequences. Should we ask what consequences would follow if everyone accepted the rule? Or should we consider what happens if most people accept it while some violate it? These formulations generate radically different assessments of which rules maximize utility. A rule permitting free riding on public goods might maximize utility if only I violate it. But universal violation would destroy the public goods everyone depends on. The ideal code formulation of rule utilitarianism evaluates rules by consequences of widespread but imperfect acceptance. We should follow rules that would maximize utility if generally internalized by people with realistic psychology. This accounts for the fact that no moral code achieves perfect compliance in practice. But determining what counts as general acceptance introduces massive empirical uncertainty into moral reasoning. Furthermore, the ideal code approach raises questions about whose acceptance matters for evaluating rules. Should we consider consequences of the code being accepted globally across all societies? Or do we evaluate acceptance within specific communities with particular circumstances? A rule against polygamy might maximize utility in one cultural context, but not another. This threatens to make rule utilitarianism collapse into cultural relativism. Both act and rule utilitarianism struggle with the problem of indeterminacy in calculating consequences. Real-world decisions involve massive uncertainty about what outcomes will actually occur. Calculating expected utility requires assigning probabilities to vastly complex causal chains. Small actions can have enormous unforeseen consequences through butterfly effects. You befriend someone who becomes inspired to pursue medical research curing millions. Or your child becomes a tyrant, causing immense suffering across generations. This uncertainty makes utilitarian calculation practically impossible for guiding real decisions. We cannot actually sum total welfare across all affected beings throughout infinite future time. Act utilitarians acknowledge this, but claim we should approximate ideal calculation as best we can. Rule utilitarians claim rules provide better approximation than case-by-case calculation. Yet both face the deeper problem that reasonable people reach radically different utility estimates. The distinction between act and rule utilitarianism ultimately may not track any deep theoretical division. Both versions share fundamental utilitarian commitments about welfare, aggregation, and consequentialism. Both face similar objections regarding rights, integrity, and the separateness of persons. The debate between them concerns decision procedures rather than fundamental moral metaphysics. Neither can escape the tension between maximizing utility and respecting common-sense moral constraints. Part 3. Historical Genesis and Intellectual Context. Utilitarianism emerged from specific historical conditions during the Enlightenment and early Industrial Revolution. Traditional morality derived authority from religious doctrine and aristocratic hierarchy. Enlightenment thinkers sought secular rational foundations for ethics independent of theology or tradition. They demanded that moral claims be justified through observation and reason. This intellectual climate made hedonism attractive as an empirically observable basis for ethics. Jeremy Bentham formulated classical utilitarianism in the late 18th century as a radical reform project. Born in 1748, Bentham witnessed profound social upheaval and injustice. English law embodied centuries of accumulated irrational tradition benefiting aristocratic privilege. Criminal punishment bore no rational relationship to deterring crime or reforming offenders. People faced execution for stealing bread, while aristocrats escaped consequences for grievous harms. Bentham proposed evaluating all laws and institutions by one simple question about their usefulness. What use is it? This secular forward-looking criterion replaced appeals to divine command or ancient precedent. Laws should maximize happiness rather than enforce religious morality or preserve class privilege. Criminal punishment should be calibrated to deter crime while inflicting minimum necessary suffering. No punishment should exceed what's needed to prevent the offence from occurring. This utilitarian framework motivated radical political reforms that transformed British society. Bentham advocated universal suffrage, including women decades before such ideas became mainstream. He argued for decriminalizing homosexuality when such acts brought execution or imprisonment. He proposed welfare systems protecting the poor through rational social insurance mechanisms. He designed prison reforms emphasizing rehabilitation over retribution and torture. Bentham's psychological hedonism grounded his ethical theory in a purportedly scientific understanding of human nature. He claimed that nature has placed mankind under governance of two sovereign masters. Pain and pleasure alone determine what we do and what we ought to do. This dual claim combined descriptive psychology with normative ethics. People are motivated by pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. And pleasure is the only good, while pain is the only evil. This linkage between psychological and ethical hedonism creates problems that persist throughout utilitarian thought. If people inevitably pursue their own pleasure, how can morality require maximizing aggregate welfare? Individual self-interest often conflicts with impartial promotion of total utility. Bentham needed to explain why rational self-interested agents would adopt utilitarian morality. His answer appealed to legal and social sanctions aligning self-interest with general welfare. Yet this instrumental justification undermines the categorical force Bentham wanted morality to possess. If utilitarianism is rational only when sanctions enforce it, morality becomes contingent on social arrangements. Without enforcement mechanisms, individuals have no reason to sacrifice personal welfare for aggregate utility. This threatens to reduce utilitarian ethics to a technology for social control. John Stuart Mill inherited utilitarian doctrine from his father James Mill and Bentham's Circle. Born in 1806, Mill received extraordinary education designed to produce a utilitarian reformer. He learned Greek at age 3 and Latin at age 8. By adolescence, he had mastered classical philosophy, economics, and logic. This intense education served Bentham's project of creating rational social reformers, but it also produced a psychological crisis that reshaped Mill's understanding of utility. At age 20, Mill suffered a severe depression lasting several years. He questioned whether achieving all utilitarian reforms would actually make him happy. Bentham's quantitative hedonism suddenly seemed inadequate to capture what makes life worth living. Mill discovered that direct pursuit of happiness as an end defeats itself. Happiness comes as a byproduct of pursuing other worthwhile activities. This realization led Mill to refine utilitarianism by incorporating qualitative distinctions among pleasures. Mill's education also exposed him to romantic poetry and philosophy alien to Bentham's austere rationalism. He absorbed ideas about individual development, creativity, and self-realization from Coleridge and Wordsworth. These influences led Mill to emphasize human capacities for noble sentiment and elevated pleasure. His utilitarianism became more sensitive to individual liberty and personal development. He argued that utility, in the largest sense, grounded on permanent interests of human beings as progressive creatures. This progressive conception introduced tensions between Mill's utilitarianism and his liberalism. On Liberty defends individual freedom through a harm principle limiting legitimate state coercion. Government may restrict liberty only to prevent harm to others. But if utility is the ultimate standard, why not restrict harmless liberty when doing so maximizes aggregate welfare? Mill insisted that protecting individual development serves long-run utility better than paternalistic intervention. Yet critics argue this defense succeeds only by smuggling non-utilitarian values into the theory. Henry Sidgwick systematized utilitarian theory in The Methods of Ethics, published in 1874. Sidgwick brought unprecedented rigor to analyzing different methods of moral reasoning. He identified 3 main approaches implicit in common-sense moral thinking. Egoism directs each person to maximize their own good. Intuitionism appeals to self-evident moral principles knowable through rational reflection. Utilitarianism requires impartial promotion of universal good. Sidgwick argued that only utilitarianism provides sufficient theoretical foundation for resolving moral conflicts. Intuitionistic moral principles like truth and justice frequently conflict in particular cases. We need some higher principle to adjudicate between competing intuitions. Utilitarianism supplies this higher principle by reference to aggregate welfare. It also provides principled guidance where intuition remains silent or vague. However, Sidgwick also identified a dualism of practical reason that threatened utilitarian foundations. Rational egoism seems just as self-evident as rational benevolence. Each person has equal reason to pursue their own good and to promote universal good impartially. But these rational requirements conflict when self-sacrifice would maximize aggregate welfare. Sidgwick could find no rational basis for resolving this fundamental conflict. He concluded that practical reason may be ultimately incoherent. Sidgwick also defended a controversial position regarding the publicity of utilitarian morality. He suggested that widespread public acceptance of utilitarianism might reduce overall utility. Common people lack sophistication to apply utilitarian calculation without corruption. They might use utilitarian reasoning to rationalize selfish behavior as maximizing welfare. Therefore, promoting esoteric utilitarian morality among an enlightened few could maximize utility better. This elitist view contradicts Bentham's democratic reform project and raises profound questions about utilitarian foundations. Earlier, thinkers developed proto-utilitarian ideas that influenced the classical utilitarians. Ancient Chinese philosopher Mozi articulated consequentialist ethics, emphasizing impartial care in the 5th century BCE. He argued for evaluating actions by their promotion of general welfare across all people. Medieval Indian philosopher Shantideva focused moral concern on producing well-being for all sentient creatures. These traditions developed remarkably similar ethical frameworks through independent philosophical reasoning. In the Western tradition, David Hume influenced utilitarianism through his emphasis on sentiment over reason in morality. Hume argued that moral distinctions arise from feelings of approval and disapproval. These sentiments respond to the utility or harm that character traits and actions produce. Virtue consists in whatever proves useful or agreeable to oneself or others. This grounds morality in observable human psychology rather than metaphysical speculation. Francis Hutcheson introduced the phrase that became utilitarianism's defining slogan. He wrote that the best action is that which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. Hutcheson developed this within a moral sense theory rather than pure consequentialism, but his formulation captured the core utilitarian commitment to maximizing aggregate welfare. Cesare Beccaria applied proto-utilitarian reasoning to criminal justice reform in continental Europe. His 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments argued that punishment should prevent crime efficiently. The severity of punishment should be proportional to harm caused and necessary for deterrence. Beccaria opposed torture and capital punishment as excessive and counterproductive. These ideas profoundly influence Bentham's utilitarian approach to law and punishment. The classical utilitarians thus synthesized various intellectual currents into a systematic ethical theory. They combined Enlightenment empiricism, reform politics, and hedonistic psychology into comprehensive moral philosophy. Their work transformed both academic ethics and practical social policy across domains. Yet the tensions and difficulties they identified continue to occupy contemporary moral philosophers. The attempt to ground morality in empirically observable welfare generates profound theoretical challenges. Part 4. The Critique from Integrity. Bernard Williams launched the most influential critique of utilitarianism by arguing it destroys personal integrity. His 1973 essay transformed how philosophers think about the relationship between morality and identity. Williams claimed that utilitarianism alienates individuals from their deepest commitments and projects. It turns moral agents into mere conduits for producing optimal outcomes. This alienation constitutes an attack on integrity in the most literal sense. Williams introduced two hypothetical cases designed to make this alienation vivid and concrete. George is an unemployed chemist with a sick wife and young children. He receives a job offer to work on chemical and biological weapons research. George finds such weapons morally abhorrent and opposes their development, but taking the job would support his family and prevent a more enthusiastic researcher from advancing weapons development. Utilitarian calculation seems to require George to accept this deeply repugnant employment. The second case involves Jim, who stumbles upon a South American captain preparing to execute 20 villagers. The captain offers Jim a choice as an honoured guest. Jim may shoot one villager himself, in which case the captain will release the remaining 19. Or Jim may refuse, in which case the captain will execute all 20. Utilitarianism appears to require Jim to kill one innocent person to save 19 lives. Williams does not claim these cases refute utilitarianism through simple counterexample. He even suggests the utilitarian may be right about what Jim should do. The cases instead illuminate something deeply troubling about utilitarian moral psychology. Utilitarianism demands that agents set aside their own projects when impartial calculation requires it. George must abandon his opposition to weapons research for marginal gains in aggregate welfare. Jim must personally kill when refusing would result in more deaths. This requirement treats the agent as a mere location where causal forces converge to produce outcomes. It makes George into a channel between various people's projects and an output of optimal decisions. His own convictions about weapons development carry no special weight in determining his action. They enter the calculation with the same status as anyone else's preferences. This neglects the extent to which actions must flow from projects constituting the agent's identity. The critique rests on Williams's conception of how projects relate to personal integrity. Projects are commitments and concerns that give meaning and direction to individual lives. They include relationships with specific people, political causes, creative pursuits, and moral commitments. These projects are not merely desires that happen to motivate action. They constitute the person's identity by defining who they are and what matters to them. To abandon such projects when calculation demands, it is to lose one's sense of self. Utilitarianism's commitment to negative responsibility intensifies this alienation from one's projects and identity. Negative responsibility holds agents equally responsible for harms they fail to prevent as harms they directly cause. If Jim refuses to shoot, he bears responsibility for all 20 deaths the captain causes. This makes no distinction between what Jim does and what happens because of what Jim does. It treats causation by action and causation by omission as morally equivalent. This erasure of the doing-allowing distinction reflects utilitarianism's impersonal consequentialist foundations. What matters is which state of affairs obtains, not who brings it about or how. 20 deaths constitute a worse outcome than one death regardless of causal pathway. But Williams argues this ignores the moral significance of individual agency. There is a crucial difference between my killing someone and someone else killing because I refuse. Agency always belongs to some particular person, not to impersonal causal processes. The distinction between doing and allowing tracks the distinction between my agency and others' agency. When I kill someone, that death flows from my agency in a way fundamentally different from deaths I fail to prevent. Holding me equally responsible for both collapses this distinction into mere causal contribution to outcomes. It makes morality about states of affairs rather than about what I do. This alienates the agent from their own actions by treating them as just more causal factors. Williams argues that utilitarianism cannot coherently describe the relationship between a person's projects and their actions. On the one hand, utilitarianism must acknowledge that people have projects constituting their identity. Without such projects, individuals would lack the commitments that give life meaning. On the other hand, utilitarianism requires treating one's own projects as dispensable when calculation demands it. They receive no special weight compared to the projects of others. This creates a distinctive form of alienation from one's moral feelings and commitments. Suppose George decides against utilitarian calculation to refuse the weapons job. A utilitarian might respond that George is being squeamish or self-indulgent. He prioritizes his own moral purity over genuine consequences, affecting many people. This response treats George's moral convictions as mere sentimental reactions to be overcome. It requires viewing his deepest ethical commitments from outside as obstacles to optimal outcomes. But our moral relation to the world is partly constituted by such feelings and commitments. To regard them purely as objects of utilitarian value is to lose a sense of moral identity. We cannot simultaneously hold deep moral convictions and treat them as mere preferences weighing against other factors. Attempting to do so induces a kind of psychological fragmentation. The person becomes alienated from their actions and from the source of their actions in their own convictions. Williams's integrity objection reveals second-order metaethical problems with utilitarian aggregation. Utilitarianism assumes that all values and projects can be aggregated from an impartial third-person perspective. But some motivational states resist such aggregation by their very nature. Deep commitments are not fungible preferences to be traded off against other people's commitments. They constitute the person's identity in a way that makes regarding them as dispensable psychologically impossible. Critics respond to Williams by charging that integrity-based objections reflect morally problematic self-indulgence. If refusing to maximize utility means more people suffer, the agent indulges their own moral squeamishness. They care more about keeping their hands clean than about actual consequences for real people. This accusation has force because Williams does not claim the utilitarian reaches wrong conclusions. If utilitarianism correctly requires Jim to shoot, refusing seems like narcissistic concern with personal purity. Williams responds that the charge of self-indulgence misconstrues the relationship between integrity and morality. The issue is not that agents want to maintain their sense of moral purity. Rather, the commitments threatened by utilitarian calculation partly constitute what it means to be a moral agent. To view those commitments purely from outside as objects of utilitarian value is to lose moral identity. We are not fully utilitarians and cannot regard our deepest convictions as mere happenings outside our moral self. Furthermore, the integrity objection does not assume that all projects deserve protection from utilitarian demands. Some projects might be evil or deeply misguided. A commitment to racial supremacy does not merit preservation even if central to someone's identity. Williams's critique targets the structure of utilitarian thinking rather than defending any particular project. The point is that reducing all moral considerations to aggregate welfare cannot accommodate the constitutive role of projects in agency. The deeper issue concerns whether any moral theory can avoid similar alienation while remaining action-guiding. Perhaps any systematic moral philosophy that aspires to resolve all moral questions will alienate agents from their particularity. Deontological theories also impose demands that conflict with personal projects and relationships. Kant's categorical imperative might require actions that violate the agent's deepest commitments. This suggests the problem may afflict moral theory generally rather than utilitarianism specifically. Williams's response denies that we need systematic moral theories covering all cases with determinate answers. Perhaps ethical life is too messy and contextual for capture by any comprehensive philosophical system. We should abandon the attempt to find a master principle resolving all moral questions. Instead, ethics should describe the thick ethical concepts people actually use in concrete contexts. This particularist approach rejects utilitarianism not merely for wrong conclusions, but for seeking false theoretical unity. The integrity objection thus operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It identifies counterintuitive implications of utilitarianism in specific cases like George and Jim. It reveals problematic assumptions about agency and responsibility underlying utilitarian consequentialism. It demonstrates psychological costs of attempting to internalize utilitarian deliberation, and it questions whether any moral theory can systematize ethics without distortion. These layers of critique continue to influence contemporary debate about the limits of consequentialist reasoning. Part 5. Rights, Justice and Distribution. Utilitarianism faces devastating objections regarding its treatment of individual rights and distributive justice. The theory permits and sometimes requires violating what we consider fundamental human rights. If torturing one innocent person would prevent greater suffering among many others, utilitarianism demands the torture. No absolute constraints protect individuals from being sacrificed for aggregate welfare maximization. This conflicts profoundly with modern moral and legal commitments to inviolable human rights. The scapegoat problem illustrates this conflict with particular vividness. A crime provokes public outrage, demanding justice and threatening violent social unrest. Police know the real perpetrator, but lack sufficient evidence to secure conviction. However, they could frame an innocent person whose conviction would satisfy public demand. Framing this scapegoat would prevent riots, maintain social order, and maximize aggregate utility. Yet punishing someone known to be innocent violates fundamental principles of justice. Standard utilitarian responses appeal to long-term consequences of allowing such rights violations. A society where police frame innocence would suffer catastrophic erosion of trust in legal institutions. Citizens would live in terror, knowing they might be scapegoated for crimes they didn't commit. This diffuse anxiety would cause more total suffering than riots prevented by framing innocence. Therefore, utility calculation itself prohibits punishing the innocent. This response fails because it depends on contingent empirical facts about consequences. We can easily construct scenarios where framing innocence does maximize utility. Suppose the framing remains secret, so no erosion of trust occurs. Or suppose the innocent victim suffers severe depression anyway, making their life barely worth living. Or suppose the riots would kill thousands, while framing one person prevents this catastrophe. In such cases, utilitarianism genuinely requires punishing innocence. The deeper problem is that utilitarian opposition to rights violations remains purely instrumental. Rights matter only insofar as respecting them tends to maximize utility in typical circumstances. But we believe rights possess intrinsic moral force, independent of consequences. Even if violating someone's rights would produce best outcomes, the violation remains wrong. This deontological conviction cannot be accommodated within purely consequentialist moral foundations. Similar difficulties arise with utilitarian treatment of distributive justice. Classical utilitarianism cares only about total aggregate welfare, regardless of how it distributes across persons. 10 units of welfare for one person count the same as 10 units distributed equally among 10 people. This makes utilitarianism indifferent between vastly unequal distributions producing same total utility. One person living in paradise while millions barely survive could maximize utility. Philosopher John Rawls developed this objection through his influential critique of classical utilitarianism. Rawls argued that utilitarianism fails to take seriously the separateness of persons. It treats society as one organism maximizing a single utility function. But individuals are distinct beings with separate lives that cannot be merged into collective welfare. Sacrificing some people's fundamental interests to benefit others treats persons as mere means. Each individual possesses inviolability founded on justice that even aggregate welfare cannot override. Rawls proposed that principles of justice should be chosen behind a veil of ignorance. Rational agents select principles without knowing their place in society or natural endowments. This ensures fairness by eliminating knowledge that might bias choice towards self-interest. Rawls argued that people behind the veil would reject utilitarian principles. They would fear being sacrificed for aggregate welfare if born into disadvantaged positions. Instead, Rawls claimed rational choosers would select his two principles of justice. First, each person has equal right to basic liberties compatible with similar liberty for all. Second, inequalities are justified only if they maximally benefit the worst-off group. This difference principle ensures that social arrangements work to advantage of the least advantaged. It prohibits sacrificing the interests of the worst off to marginally increase aggregate welfare. Utilitarians respond that Rawls's contractarian argument fails to establish his preferred principles. Rational agents behind the veil might adopt average utility maximization as their decision rule. This would lead them to choose utilitarian principles rather than Rawlsian justice. The argument turns on contested claims about rational choice under uncertainty. Different assumptions about risk aversion generate different principles from the original position. Furthermore, utilitarian principles can accommodate concerns about distribution through diminishing marginal utility. The first dollar benefits a poor person more than the millionth dollar benefits a wealthy person. Therefore, utility maximization often requires substantial redistribution from rich to poor. This built-in egalitarian tendency makes utilitarianism less radically different from Rawlsian justice than appears. Practical policy implications may converge even if theoretical foundations differ. However, this utilitarian response proves too much by making egalitarianism contingent on empirical facts. If rich people somehow extracted more utility from additional resources than poor people, utilitarianism would require concentrating wealth. The commitment to equality rests on psychological facts about declining marginal utility. But our conviction that extreme inequality is unjust seems independent of such contingencies. We believe fairness constrains distribution regardless of utility functions. The utility monster objection reveals another disturbing implication regarding distribution. Imagine a being who experiences vastly greater pleasure from resources than normal people. This utility monster might gain more welfare from consuming everything than billions gain from sharing. Utilitarianism would require funneling all resources to the monster while everyone else starves. Most find this conclusion morally abhorrent, regardless of aggregate utility produced. Utilitarians respond that such monsters are biological impossibilities given actual human psychology. But the objection reveals that utilitarianism's commitment to equity rests entirely on contingent facts about how beings experience welfare. If utility monsters existed, the theory truly would require maximally unequal distribution. This shows that fairness considerations cannot be derived from utilitarian foundations alone. Population ethics generates even more severe difficulties for utilitarian approaches to distribution. The repugnant conclusion shows that total utilitarianism implies we should maximize population even if lives barely worth living. Adding billions of people with marginally positive welfare increases total utility. A world with trillion people living miserable lives could contain more total utility than millions flourishing. Yet most find a world of barely tolerable existence repugnant compared to smaller population of flourishing lives. Average utilitarianism tries to avoid repugnant conclusion by maximizing average welfare rather than total. But this creates equally counterintuitive implications regarding population and distribution. Average utilitarianism might require killing happy people if doing so raises average among survivors. It makes creating miserable people worse than creating nobody while permitting mediocre lives. And it exhibits sadistic conclusion that creating suffering people can be good if it lowers average. These population paradoxes reveal deep problems with utilitarian aggregation across possible people. We lack clear intuitions about how to weigh total against average welfare. We cannot determine whether adding people with positive welfare makes outcomes better. Yet utilitarianism requires commensurable comparison of all welfare across actual and possible beings. The theory cannot provide determinate guidance without resolving these fundamental questions. Some utilitarians embrace variable value principles where adding people affects weight given to existing people. But such principles sacrifice the elegant simplicity that made utilitarianism attractive. They introduce ad hoc modifications designed to avoid counterintuitive conclusions. This suggests the problems stem from utilitarian foundations rather than details of the calculation. The incompleteness of utilitarian theory regarding population and distribution points to deeper theoretical issues. Perhaps welfare cannot be cardinally measured and interpersonally compared in ways utilitarian calculation requires. Different people may experience pleasure and pain in incommensurable ways. There may be no objective fact about whether your suffering outweighs my joy. Without such comparisons, utilitarian aggregation loses its claimed precision and determinacy. Rights-based and justice-based theories avoid these aggregation problems by imposing constraints on permissible trade-offs. They deny that all moral considerations reduce to maximizing a single value. Some rights or principles limit what can be done even for optimal consequences. This pluralistic approach may better capture the complexity of moral thought, but it sacrifices the theoretical unity and practical guidance utilitarianism promises. Part 6. Demandingness and the moral saint problem. Utilitarianism appears to require that we constantly sacrifice our own interests for aggregate welfare maximization. Most of our daily activities fail to produce optimal consequences compared to available alternatives. When you watch television, you could instead volunteer at a hospital saving lives. When you buy luxuries, you could instead donate to effective charities preventing deaths from poverty. Utilitarian calculation seems to make almost everything we do morally wrong. This demandingness objection reveals profound tension between utilitarian theory and common-sense moral practice. We believe morality permits significant pursuit of personal projects and relationships. Parents may give extra resources to their own children rather than strangers' children. Artists may pursue creative work that produces less utility than medical charity. Such partial commitments seem morally acceptable, not continuous moral failure. Peter Singer's argument about global poverty makes utilitarian demands vivid and concrete. If you pass a shallow pond where a child is drowning, you should obviously save them. The cost to you is minor compared to the child's death. But children dying from preventable poverty differ from drowning children only in physical proximity. Distance makes no moral difference when you can save lives equally easily. Therefore, you must donate to poverty relief until further donations harm you more than they help others. This argument implies that anyone with resources beyond bare subsistence lives immorally by utilitarian standards. You should give up entertainment, luxury goods, and most personal spending. Your life should focus entirely on maximizing your positive impact on aggregate welfare. Maintaining expensive hobbies becomes morally equivalent to letting children die. Most people's actual lives constitute catastrophic ongoing moral failure by these standards. Utilitarians respond that the demandingness objection merely shows morality is difficult. perhaps we actually do wrong by failing to sacrifice more for others. Our intuitions about permissible partiality may reflect self-serving bias rather than moral truth. The fact that utilitarian principles demand great sacrifices doesn't make them false. It shows how far ordinary life diverges from what morality genuinely requires. This response treats common-sense moral permissions as systematic error requiring correction. But such widespread convergent intuitions provide evidence against, rather than for, utilitarian theory. If almost everyone's life constitutes massive moral failure, perhaps the theory has gone wrong. Morality should be capable of guiding imperfect people in realistic circumstances. A theory requiring sainthood from everyone seems practically useless and psychologically alienating. The moral saint problem deepens these worries about utilitarian demands. Susan Wolf identified how utilitarian sainthood would distort and impoverish human life. A person who maximizes utility at every moment must eliminate all activities that merely please themselves. They cannot pursue hobbies, develop talents unrelated to helping others, or maintain friendships for their own sake. Everything must be instrumentalized toward aggregate welfare production. Such a moral saint would possess a deeply unattractive character by ordinary standards. They would lack genuine friendship because they value friends only as means to utility. They would have no appreciation for beauty or humor unless it serves welfare maximization. Their entire personality would be consumed by the single-minded pursuit of doing good. Yet we don't admire people who make themselves into mere instruments for optimal outcomes. Wolf argues that morality should leave space for non-moral values and excellences. Human flourishing requires developing capacities for aesthetic appreciation, intellectual inquiry, and playful creativity. These goods have value independent of their contribution to aggregate welfare. A life well lived includes pursuits that make no claim to maximizing utility. Utilitarianism cannot accommodate this plurality of values because it reduces everything to welfare production. Furthermore, the moral saint cannot form genuine loving relationships because utilitarianism requires impartial benevolence. Loving someone means caring about them in ways that transcend their contribution to aggregate utility. You prioritize your partner's welfare not because doing so maximizes total welfare, but because they're your partner. This partiality appears essential to love, yet violates utilitarian impartiality. The moral saint must view everyone with equal concern, making deep, particular attachments impossible. Williams developed this objection through his famous case of the person and their drowning wife. Suppose someone saves their drowning spouse from a river. If asked to justify this action, responding by appeal to impartial utilitarian calculation exhibits one thought too many. The thought that saving her maximizes utility should not enter as a reason for action. Love requires saving her because she's your wife, not because doing so produces optimal consequences. Utilitarians respond by distinguishing between decision procedures and criteria of rightness. Utilitarianism claims actions are right when they maximize utility. But it doesn't claim agents should always consciously calculate utility before acting. In many situations, following rules of thumb or acting from love produces better outcomes than explicit calculation. The loving husband saves his wife from direct emotion without utilitarian deliberation. This two-level strategy attempts to reconcile utilitarian foundations with non-utilitarian psychology. At the theoretical level, only utility determines right action. At the practical level, agents internalize dispositions and emotions that reliably promote utility. We should cultivate love, friendship, and integrity because such traits generally maximize welfare. But their value remains instrumental to utility rather than intrinsic. However, this response proves deeply unstable under reflection. If you know that your love is valuable only as means to utility, does it remain genuine love? Can you simultaneously believe your child matters specially to you and that this special concern has purely instrumental value? The two-level strategy requires psychological compartmentalization that may be impossible for reflective agents. Moreover, the strategy seems to make utilitarian theory irrelevant to practical moral reasoning. If we shouldn't consciously apply utilitarian calculation, what purpose does the theory serve? It becomes a mere scorecard for evaluating actions rather than guide for deliberation. Yet this converts utilitarianism into something quite different from what its founders intended. Bentham designed the felicific calculus precisely as a practical decision procedure. Some utilitarians embrace satisficing rather than maximizing as the proper standard. Morality requires doing enough good rather than maximally possible good. You must help others up to some threshold of sacrifice, but retain permission to pursue personal projects. This satisficing approach makes utilitarianism less demanding while retaining consequentialist foundations. But satisficing faces severe theoretical difficulties in specifying the relevant threshold. How much good is enough good from utilitarian perspective? Any threshold below maximum seems arbitrary and unprincipled. If more good could be done, why does morality permit doing less? The satisficing response abandons maximization without providing alternative theoretical foundation. Agent-centered prerogatives offer another strategy for limiting utilitarian demands. These are permissions to give extra weight to one's own interests and projects in moral deliberation. You may pursue personal goals even when sacrificing them would produce marginally better outcomes for others. This makes morality less demanding while preserving consequentialist structure for evaluating options. However, agent-centered prerogatives seem inconsistent with fundamental utilitarian commitments. Why should the moral calculation weight your welfare more heavily than others' welfare? From the impartial perspective utilitarianism requires, such partiality appears unjustified. The prerogatives smuggle deontological or virtue-based considerations into consequentialist theory. They succeed in making demands reasonable only by ceasing to be genuinely utilitarian. The demandingness objection thus reveals that utilitarianism cannot accommodate important features of human moral psychology. It makes morality so demanding that compliance becomes psychologically unrealistic for imperfect beings. Its conception of moral sainthood describes lives we find unattractive rather than admirable. And attempts to moderate its demands either lack principled theoretical foundation or abandon core utilitarian commitments. These difficulties suggest that purely maximizing consequentialism may be fundamentally unsuited to human ethical life. Part 7. Brain, Mind, and Moral Judgment. Neuroscience research reveals that utilitarian and deontological moral judgments recruit different brain systems. Joshua Green pioneered functional magnetic resonance imaging studies of moral decision-making in the early 2000s. He presented subjects with trolley problem variants while measuring brain activity patterns. Personal moral dilemmas, like pushing someone off a footbridge, activated emotional processing regions. Impersonal dilemmas, like flipping a switch, activated areas associated with controlled reasoning. The dual process theory proposes that two cognitive systems compete in generating moral judgments. System 1 operates automatically, quickly, and relies heavily on emotional responses. System 2 engages in slow, effortful, controlled deliberation about consequences. Characteristically, deontological judgments receive preferential support from automatic emotional processing. Utilitarian judgments depend more on conscious-controlled cognitive processes. Green's research showed that the footbridge dilemma activates the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and amygdala. These regions process emotional responses and social cognition about harming others. The thought of pushing someone to their death triggers strong emotional aversion. This emotional signal conflicts with cognitive calculation that one death prevents 5 deaths. The anterior cingulate cortex shows increased activity during such conflicts between emotion and reason. In contrast, the switch case activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex more strongly. This region supports abstract reasoning and cognitive control processes. Pulling a switch feels emotionally distant even though it still causes death. The impersonal nature of the action fails to trigger strong emotional opposition. Therefore, cognitive utilitarian reasoning faces no competing emotional signal. Studies using cognitive load manipulation support the dual process interpretation of these findings. When subjects perform demanding cognitive tasks while making moral judgments, utilitarian responses decrease. Cognitive load interferes with the controlled reasoning needed for utilitarian calculation. This leaves automatic emotional responses more influential in determining judgment. The effect appears specifically for personal dilemmas where emotion and reason conflict. Time pressure studies show similar patterns supporting the dual process account. Forcing quick decisions increases deontological judgments in personal moral dilemmas. Allowing more deliberation time increases utilitarian judgments. This suggests that the utilitarian response requires overriding initial emotional reactions through controlled processing. The emotional signal arrives quickly while rational calculation takes time. Patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex show altered moral judgment patterns. Such patients exhibit reduced emotional responses while maintaining intact cognitive reasoning abilities. They make significantly more utilitarian judgments in personal moral dilemmas than healthy controls. This supports the claim that emotional processing normally opposes utilitarian conclusions in personal cases. When emotion gets disrupted, utilitarian reasoning faces less opposition. However, these neuroscience findings carry complex and contested normative implications. Green argues that discovering emotional origins of deontological judgments undermines their reliability. If moral intuitions against pushing the fat man reflect arbitrary emotional responses rather than moral insight, we should discount them. The fact that personal force triggers emotion seems morally irrelevant to evaluating consequences. Therefore, we should rely more heavily on explicit utilitarian reasoning about outcomes. This argument from debunking assumes that the emotional basis of deontological judgments shows them unreliable. But critics respond that emotional moral responses might track genuine moral truths. Evolution and culture could have calibrated our emotions to respond appropriately to morally relevant features. The revulsion at pushing someone might reliably detect violations of dignity or autonomy. Discovering the psychological mechanism doesn't automatically debunk the judgment. Furthermore, the dual process theory faces empirical challenges from subsequent research. Some studies fail to replicate the association between cognitive load and reduced utilitarian judgment. Others show that emotion influences consequentialist reasoning as well as deontological judgment. The clean separation between emotional deontology and rational utilitarianism may oversimplify actual moral cognition. Both systems likely contribute to both types of moral conclusion. The interpretation of trolley problem responses as measuring utilitarian tendencies also faces criticism. These dilemmas test only willingness to harm one person to save several others. But utilitarianism involves much more than accepting instrumental harm for greater good. It requires impartial concern for welfare and commitment to maximizing aggregate well-being. Someone might endorse pushing the fat man from selfish indifference rather than utilitarian calculation. Research using process dissociation models reveals that utilitarian responses in trolley cases don't correlate with impartial beneficence. Accepting instrumental harm associates with reduced empathy and antisocial personality traits. Genuine utilitarian concern for maximizing welfare represents a distinct psychological dimension. Trolley judgments may measure insensitivity to harm rather than commitment to aggregate welfare. This undermines using such cases to vindicate utilitarian moral philosophy. The neuroscience research does establish important facts about the psychology of moral judgment. Emotional responses genuinely influence moral conclusions in ways people often don't recognize. Personal force, physical proximity, and intentionality affect judgments through emotional channels. These factors seem morally arbitrary, yet powerfully shape what actions people find permissible. Understanding such influences can help us evaluate whether they should guide moral reasoning. However, the normative implications remain deeply contested among philosophers. Some argue neuroscience vindicates utilitarianism by revealing the emotional basis of competing intuitions. Others claim it shows utilitarianism conflicts with moral psychology that serves important functions. The empirical discoveries about brain processes don't automatically settle normative ethical questions. We still must decide whether emotional moral responses track truth or represent obstacles to it. The research also reveals interesting connections between utilitarian judgment and executive function. People with higher working memory capacity make more utilitarian judgments in moral dilemmas. This supports the claim that utilitarian reasoning requires cognitive resources for complex calculation. but it also raises questions about whether utilitarian conclusions depend on cognitive abilities varying across people. Should moral truth depend on having sophisticated executive function? Cross-cultural neuroscience studies show variation in how different populations respond to trolley dilemmas. Some cultures show stronger emotional responses to personal harm across various contexts. Others exhibit more willingness to accept instrumental harm for collective benefit. These differences correlate with cultural values regarding individualism versus collectivism. This suggests that both emotion and cognition in moral judgment reflect cultural learning. The neuroscience of moral judgment thus reveals the complex psychology underlying utilitarian and deontological reasoning. Multiple brain systems contribute to moral conclusions through interacting emotional and cognitive processes. Understanding these mechanisms helps explain why people reach different moral judgments. But it cannot alone determine which moral theory we should endorse. The relationship between psychological description and normative ethics remains philosophically contested. Part 8. Real-world applications. Utilitarian reasoning profoundly shapes contemporary medical ethics and healthcare resource allocation decisions. Triage protocols in emergency medicine explicitly prioritize saving the greatest number of lives. When resources cannot treat all patients, doctors allocate care to maximize total lives saved. Someone with better survival chances receives priority over someone likely to die, regardless of intervention. This utilitarian logic can require withholding treatment from patients who would benefit if resources were unlimited. The Quality-Adjusted Life Year provides a utilitarian metric for comparing medical interventions. 1 QALE represents 1 year of life in perfect health. Medical conditions and treatments receive numerical ratings for their impact on quality of life. Healthcare systems use QALYs to determine which interventions provide most benefit per dollar spent. A treatment saving 10 years at 80% quality scores 8 QALYs. This utilitarian framework generates deeply controversial implications for healthcare policy. It suggests that saving young people provides more value than saving elderly people. Treating rare diseases becomes less cost-effective than common conditions affecting many people. Extending lives of severely disabled individuals may score lower than treating minor ailments in healthy people. Such conclusions clash with commitments to equal treatment and non-discrimination. Pandemic response policies reveal tensions between utilitarian efficiency and individual rights or fairness. Ventilator allocation protocols during the COVID-19 crisis used utilitarian criteria prioritizing survival probability. Younger, healthier patients received scarce ventilators over older patients with lower survival chances. This maximized total lives saved, but meant denying treatment to many who could have benefited. Critics argued this violated principles of equal dignity and non-abandonment of vulnerable populations. Vaccine distribution strategies similarly invoke utilitarian reasoning about maximizing population health. Giving vaccines first to healthcare workers prevents more deaths than random distribution. Targeting high-risk populations reduces severe illness and death most efficiently, but utilitarian optimization can conflict with fairness concerns about equal access. Should wealthy nations vaccinate their entire populations before poor nations receive any doses? Economic analysis applies utilitarian frameworks to evaluate policies and regulations. Cost-benefit analysis compares total benefits against total costs of proposed government interventions. Regulations pass only when monetized benefits exceed costs from an aggregate welfare perspective. This requires assigning dollar values to human lives, environmental damage, and other hard-to-quantify goods. The Environmental Protection Agency values a statistical life at roughly $10 million for regulatory purposes. Such valuations enable comparing completely different types of harms and benefits in common terms. Should we spend billions reducing air pollution that causes respiratory disease? The analysis requires estimating pollution's health effects, valuing those health impacts, and comparing against costs. This utilitarian approach makes policy decisions systematic and evidence-based. But it also reduces human welfare to monetary equivalents many find morally troubling. The effective altruism movement represents contemporary utilitarianism's most explicit practical application. Effective altruists use evidence and reason to determine how to benefit others maximally. They calculate which charitable interventions save lives or prevent suffering most cost-effectively. Distributing anti-malaria bed nets in Africa saves lives much more cheaply than most charity work. Therefore, utilitarian reasoning directs resources toward global health interventions over local causes. Effective altruism extends to career choice by encouraging people to maximize their lifetime positive impact. Instead of directly helping people, some should pursue high-earning careers and donate substantial portions of their income. A software engineer earning hundreds of thousands of dollars annually might fund dozens of lives saved through efficient charities. This produces more good than working directly in poverty relief, earning modest salary. The movement thus applies utilitarian calculation to fundamental life decisions. Long-termism within effective altruism focuses utilitarian concern on vast future populations. Billions or trillions of people could exist in coming centuries if humanity survives. Therefore, reducing existential risks that could destroy humanity provides enormous expected utility. Even small probability reductions in extinction risk could outweigh near-term poverty relief. This reasoning directs resources toward preventing artificial intelligence catastrophes, nuclear war, or engineered pandemics. Critics argue this long-termist reasoning leads to morally objectionable conclusions. It can justify imposing significant harms on present people to marginally reduce distant hypothetical risks. The astronomical value assigned to future populations makes current generations' welfare nearly irrelevant. This resembles fanaticism, where speculative calculations about vast numbers override immediate concrete needs. It also concentrates power in hands of people claiming special knowledge about existential risks. Animal welfare advocacy applies utilitarian arguments about extending moral consideration to all sentient beings. Factory farming causes immense suffering to billions of animals annually. Utilitarian calculation counting animal welfare suggests eating meat causes far more harm than benefit. The brief pleasure humans derive from consuming animal products cannot outweigh massive suffering inflicted on animals. Therefore, utilitarianism requires vegetarianism or veganism absent special circumstances. Some utilitarians extend this further to advocate for wild animal welfare interventions. Vast numbers of wild animals suffer from disease, starvation, and predation. If we could reduce this suffering through ecosystem management, utilitarian logic requires doing so. This could mean vaccinating wild animals, providing supplemental food, or even redesigning ecosystems. Critics find such proposals absurd and hubristic about human capacity to improve natural processes. Utilitarian frameworks influence legal punishment theory through deterrence-focused criminal justice. Punishment should prevent crime through deterring potential offenders from illegal conduct. Penalties should be calibrated to provide minimum necessary deterrent against various crimes. More severe punishments are justified only when they produce greater deterrent effect. This rejects retributive theories that punish wrongdoers because they deserve suffering for their crimes. However, pure deterrence theory faces serious objections similar to those against utilitarianism generally. It could require punishing innocent people if doing so would effectively deter crime. Framing innocence might deter better than punishing actual offenders in some circumstances. It also struggles to explain why punishment severity should be proportional to crime severity. If harsh punishment for minor crimes deters effectively, deterrence theory seems to endorse it. Utilitarianism shapes discourse around global poverty and development aid allocation. Singer's famous argument claims affluent people must donate until sacrifice becomes comparable to harm prevented. This would require most wealthy individuals to give away substantial majority of their resources. The argument rests on the principle that suffering and death from lack of resources are bad. If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable importance, we should do it. Development economics applies utilitarian frameworks to evaluate poverty reduction interventions. Randomized, controlled trials measure how different programs affect welfare of recipients. Cash transfers, education programs, and health interventions get compared on utility produced per dollar. This evidence-based approach directs resources toward proven, effective interventions. But it reduces complex human situations to quantifiable metrics that may miss important dimensions. Utilitarian reasoning influences environmental policy through calculations of optimal pollution levels. Economic analysis seeks the level of environmental protection that maximizes net benefits. Zero pollution would eliminate production benefits exceeding harms from moderate pollution. Therefore, optimal policy allows some pollution where benefits outweigh damages. This conflicts with environmentalist intuitions that nature possesses intrinsic value beyond human welfare. Climate change policy involves utilitarian calculations about intergenerational trade-offs. Current generation must sacrifice economic growth to prevent future climate catastrophe. But how much should present people sacrifice for benefits accruing to distant future generations? Discount rates in economic analysis affect whether aggressive climate action appears cost-effective. High discount rates make future benefits count for little, permitting substantial climate damages. These real-world applications reveal both the power and the problems of utilitarian frameworks. Utilitarian analysis provides systematic methods for making difficult decisions involving trade-offs. It forces explicit consideration of consequences and benefits from evidence-based evaluation. But it also reduces human welfare to quantitative metrics that may distort moral reality. And it generates conclusions that violate deeply held moral convictions about rights, fairness, and human dignity. Part 9. Utilitarian Responses and Refinements. Utilitarians have developed sophisticated responses to standard objections by modifying classical theory. Two-level utilitarianism distinguishes between theoretical criterion of rightness and practical decision procedure. R.M. Hare systematized this approach by separating critical and intuitive levels of moral thinking. Critical thinking applies utilitarian principles directly to determine what actions are genuinely right. Intuitive thinking follows rules and cultivates dispositions that reliably promote utility in ordinary circumstances. This two-level structure attempts to reconcile utilitarian foundations with common-sense moral psychology. Most people should operate at the intuitive level, following rules about honesty, promise-keeping, and loyalty. Such rules generally maximize utility when widely internalized, even if occasional violations would produce better outcomes. Only in unusual circumstances should agents ascend to critical thinking and directly calculate consequences. This explains why good people don't constantly perform utilitarian calculations. The approach also addresses Williams's integrity objection by permitting non-utilitarian motivations. Parents should love their children from direct emotional attachment rather than calculated utility maximization. But this emotional structure is justified because societies where parents love children produce better outcomes. The theoretical foundation remains utilitarian, even when practical psychology is not. Love and integrity serve as means to utility rather than possessing independent moral status. However, the two-level strategy faces serious difficulties regarding its psychological plausibility. Can reflective moral agents genuinely internalize non-utilitarian motivations while knowing they have purely instrumental value? If you understand your love for your child serves only to maximize aggregate welfare, does it remain genuine love? The compartmentalization required seems psychologically unstable for self-aware individuals. When critical and intuitive levels conflict, agents must somehow ignore what critical thinking reveals. Furthermore, the theory provides no clear guidance about when to employ critical versus intuitive thinking. If you always stay at the intuitive level, you never truly apply utilitarian principles. If you frequently ascend to critical thinking, you lose the psychological benefits of intuitive rules. The theory needs principles for determining when to shift levels, but cannot provide them without circularity. Using critical thinking to decide when to use critical thinking leads to infinite regress. Rule consequentialism offers a different refinement that evaluates acts by reference to optimal rules. Brad Hooker's influential formulation asks what code of rules would maximize expected utility if internalized by everyone. This ideal code must be learnable and followable by real people with realistic motivational capacities. Acts are right when they conform to rules in the code that would produce best consequences if generally accepted. This differs from rule utilitarianism by focusing on actual acceptance rather than hypothetical universal compliance. Rule consequentialism claims to avoid the collapse problem plaguing earlier versions of rule utilitarianism. We evaluate rules by consequences of general acceptance rather than universal following of maximally specific rules. This prevents rules from becoming so qualified and complex that they reduce to act-by-act calculation. The constraint that rules must be learnable by ordinary people limits excessive qualification. Simple general principles that people can actually internalize structure the moral code. However, rule consequentialism still faces the fundamental question of why we should follow such rules. If breaking a rule in particular circumstances would produce better consequences, why does conformity to the rule matter? The answer must be that general acceptance of the rule produces good consequences. But your individual violation doesn't undermine general acceptance when others continue following the rule. Therefore, rule consequentialism seems to collapse back into a form of act consequentialism. Scalar consequentialism abandons the binary distinction between right and wrong actions altogether. Instead, it evaluates actions along a continuous scale, according to how much good they produce. Some actions are better than others, but none strictly required or forbidden. This dissolves problems about demandingness because the theory doesn't demand maximum sacrifice. It simply says that greater sacrifice produces better outcomes without claiming you must perform the best action. This scalar approach avoids generating counterintuitive conclusions about right and wrong. It doesn't claim that failing to donate all your wealth to charity makes you act wrongly. It merely observes that donating more would be better than donating less. There's no sharp line between permissible and impermissible action. Morality becomes a matter of degree rather than absolute categories. Critics object that scalar consequentialism abandons morality's action-guiding function. If nothing is required or forbidden, the theory provides no practical guidance for decision-making. It describes a ranking of options without telling agents which option to choose. This makes it useless for resolving moral dilemmas or determining obligations. The theory becomes merely evaluative rather than genuinely normative. Satisficing consequentialism proposes that morality requires doing enough good rather than maximum possible good. Actions are right when they produce outcomes that are good enough even if better options exist. This makes the theory less demanding while retaining consequentialist structure. You must help others up to some threshold, but retain permission to pursue personal projects beyond that point. The threshold might be specified by what a virtuous person would do or what rules would generally maximize utility. The major difficulty for satisficing is specifying where the threshold lies without arbitrary stipulation. From purely consequentialist perspective, more good is always better than less good. Any threshold below maximum seems unprincipled unless it appeals to non-consequentialist considerations. The theory must import virtue ethics or contractualism to determine what counts as enough. This makes satisficing consequentialism an unstable hybrid rather than genuine refinement of utilitarianism. Pluralistic consequentialism expands the theory of value beyond welfare to include multiple intrinsic goods. Perhaps knowledge, beauty, friendship and autonomy possess value independent of their contribution to pleasure or preference satisfaction. Actions are right when they maximize the sum of these diverse goods. This avoids problems with pure hedonism or preference satisfaction. It can accommodate the intuition that achievement matters even when it doesn't feel pleasant. However, pluralistic theories face severe difficulties regarding comparability and aggregation of different values. How do we weigh knowledge against friendship or beauty against autonomy? Without a common metric, consequentialist calculation becomes impossible. Different reasonable people assign radically different weights to various goods. This makes pluralistic consequentialism indeterminate and unable to provide definite moral guidance. Global consequentialism evaluates not just acts, but also rules, motives, character traits, and institutions. The theory assesses everything by its consequences for overall goodness. This allows responding to objections by showing that consequentialism, properly understood, doesn't require constant utility calculation. Having non-calculating character traits might produce better outcomes than explicitly consequentialist dispositions. Institutions that don't directly maximize utility at every decision might still maximize utility overall. Critics argue that global consequentialism becomes so flexible it loses distinctive content. If consequentialism can endorse any rule or character trait on grounds of indirect effects, it becomes unfalsifiable. The theory can rationalize any moral conclusion by appealing to speculative long-term consequences. This makes it impossible to distinguish genuinely consequentialist views from non-consequentialist alternatives. The refinement succeeds only by ceasing to be meaningfully consequentialist. Sophisticated utilitarians also emphasize that objections based on counterintuitive implications may misfire. Our moral intuitions evolved in small-scale societies with limited resources and local concerns. Modern circumstances involving global populations and vast technological powers differ radically from ancestral environment. Intuitions calibrated for ancestral contexts may prove unreliable guides to morality in contemporary world. Therefore, counterintuitive conclusions might indicate that our intuitions need revision rather than utilitarian theory being false. This response faces the difficulty that it applies selectively to intuitions conflicting with utilitarianism. Utilitarians still appeal to intuitions supporting their theory, such as impartiality and concern for welfare. The methodology becomes inconsistent by accepting some intuitions while rejecting others based on theoretical convenience. We need principled account of which intuitions to trust rather than ad hoc selection. These various refinements and responses show utilitarianism's remarkable adaptability to criticism. The theory has evolved substantially from Bentham's simple hedonistic calculus. Modern sophisticated versions address many classic objections through structural modifications. But critics argue these refinements succeed only by importing non-utilitarian elements that undermine the theory's distinctive character. The debate continues about whether refined utilitarianism can capture morality's complexity without losing theoretical coherence. Part 10. Contemporary Debates and Misconceptions. A persistent misconception treats utilitarianism as equivalent to crude selfishness or expedient calculation. Popular usage describes someone as utilitarian when they disregard moral constraints for practical advantage. This completely misrepresents actual utilitarian theory, which demands impartial concern for everyone's welfare. Genuine utilitarianism often requires enormous personal sacrifice rather than selfish calculation. The confusion stems from misunderstanding utility as mere usefulness rather than welfare or well-being. Another common error assumes utilitarianism cannot distinguish between different sources of pleasure. Critics claim the theory makes no distinction between reading poetry and playing simple games. But even Bentham acknowledged different dimensions of pleasure beyond mere quantity. Mill's qualitative hedonism explicitly ranks intellectual pleasures above bodily ones. Modern preference utilitarians evaluate satisfaction of informed reflective preferences. The theory need not treat all pleasures as equivalent. Many people mistakenly believe utilitarianism requires constant explicit calculation of consequences. They imagine utilitarians performing complex arithmetic before every minor decision. But sophisticated utilitarianism recognizes that such calculation would be practically impossible and counterproductive. Two-level approaches and rule consequentialism operate through internalized dispositions in ordinary circumstances. Direct utilitarian calculation applies only in unusual cases where rules conflict or prove inadequate. The misconception that utilitarianism ignores individual rights misses the theory's indirect protection of rights. While utilitarianism denies that rights possess intrinsic moral force independent of consequences, it strongly supports rights instrumentally. Societies protecting individual rights typically produce far better outcomes than oppressive regimes. Legal and moral rights serve as extremely valuable rules, maximizing aggregate welfare. Utilitarians can endorse robust rights while justifying them through consequentialist reasoning. However, critics correctly note this instrumental justification makes rights contingent in troubling ways. If circumstances changed such that violating rights maximized utility, utilitarianism would endorse the violation. The protection of rights depends on empirical facts about consequences rather than inherent dignity. This difference matters even if practical conclusions converge in most actual cases. The theoretical foundation affects how we think about rights and their role in moral reasoning. Contemporary debate continues about whether utilitarianism constitutes a comprehensive moral theory or merely part of ethics. Some argue that consequentialist reasoning captures important dimension of morality without exhausting moral truth. Other considerations like virtue, rights, and relationships constitute additional independent moral domains. Utilitarianism provides valuable perspective on consequences without being the whole story. This pluralistic approach avoids the theory's counterintuitive implications while preserving its insights. Defenders of utilitarian comprehensiveness respond that alleged non-consequentialist considerations reduce to consequences properly understood. Virtue matters because virtuous people reliably produce good outcomes through their character traits. Rights matter because protecting them serves aggregate welfare better than violating them. Personal relationships matter because they constitute important component of human well-being. Everything of moral significance can be accommodated within sophisticated consequentialist framework. The debate about utilitarian comprehensiveness connects to broader meta-ethical disputes. Moral pluralists claim that different values are genuinely incommensurable and cannot be reduced to common currency. Justice, beauty, knowledge, and welfare constitute distinct goods without shared measure for comparison. Therefore, no single principle can determine right action across all contexts. Utilitarianism's attempt to reduce everything to welfare fundamentally misunderstands moral reality. Utilitarians respond that practical decision-making requires comparing and weighing conflicting considerations. If values are genuinely incommensurable, rational choice becomes impossible when they conflict. We must make decisions balancing different goods, whether or not theory acknowledges common measure. Utilitarianism simply makes explicit the comparisons we implicitly make in practice. The alternative is moral paralysis or arbitrary choice without principled basis. Evolutionary debunking arguments present novel challenges to utilitarian claims about moral truth. If moral beliefs evolved to promote reproductive success rather than track moral truth, why should we trust them? This applies equally to utilitarian intuitions about impartiality and aggregate welfare. Our concern for others may reflect evolutionary mechanisms for reciprocal altruism within groups. This genealogy casts doubt on utilitarian principles just as much as deontological constraints. Utilitarians respond that evolutionary explanations of moral beliefs don't automatically debunk their truth. Evolution might have equipped us with reliable moral faculties tracking genuine moral properties. Mathematical beliefs also have evolutionary explanations, but mathematics remains objectively true. The genealogy of belief is separate from the question of its justification. We can acknowledge evolutionary origins while defending utilitarian principles through rational argument. The relationship between utilitarianism and relativism generates ongoing confusion. Some worry that basing morality on welfare makes it subjective or culturally relative. But classical utilitarians defended objective universal moral truth grounded in observable facts about pleasure and pain. Different cultures may reach different conclusions through different empirical beliefs about consequences. The moral principle remains universal even when its application varies across contexts. However, modern preference utilitarianism faces more serious relativism concerns. If welfare consists in satisfying whatever preferences people happen to have, morality becomes preference relative. Different preferences generate different moral conclusions, even with identical consequences. This seems to make morality less objective than classical hedonistic utilitarianism. The theory must either defend moral realism about preferences or accept anti-realist implications. Utilitarianism's status as naturalistic ethical theory generates both support and criticism. Naturalists appreciate that utilitarianism grounds morality in empirically observable phenomena like pleasure and pain. This avoids appealing to mysterious non-natural moral properties inaccessible to scientific investigation. Morality becomes continuous with our ordinary understanding of human psychology and welfare. This naturalistic foundation makes ethics compatible with modern scientific worldview. Critics argue that naturalistic reduction cannot capture normativity essential to moral concepts. Facts about pleasure and pain describe what is, not what ought to be. No amount of empirical observation can establish that maximizing welfare is morally required. The move from descriptive facts to normative conclusions requires additional non-naturalistic premises. Utilitarianism faces the open question whether promoting welfare is genuinely good. The demandingness objection continues to generate sophisticated responses on both sides. Some utilitarians embrace the demanding implications, while others seek to moderate them through theoretical refinements. Debates rage about whether morality can be extremely demanding or whether extreme demands indicate theoretical error. The disagreement reflects deeper differences about morality's role in human life. Should morality provide one consideration among others or dominate all practical reasoning? Recent work explores connections between utilitarianism and probability theory through expected utility maximization. When outcomes are uncertain, utilitarianism requires choosing actions with highest expected utility. This involves multiplying utility of each possible outcome by its probability and summing across outcomes. The framework provides elegant decision theory for reasoning under uncertainty. But it inherits all the difficulties of utilitarian value theory, plus additional problems about probability. Pascal's mugging illustrates how expected utility maximization can generate absurd conclusions. Someone threatens unfathomable suffering to vast numbers of people unless you pay them money. Even if the threat has tiny probability of being real, expected utility calculation favors paying. Tiny probability multiplied by astronomical disutility exceeds certain smaller harms from payment. This suggests expected utility theory needs modifications to avoid being held hostage by unlikely claims. Population ethics remains the most intractable area for utilitarian theory. Total, average, and variable value principles each generate deeply counterintuitive conclusions. No formulation successfully avoids the repugnant conclusion and other population paradoxes. This suggests fundamental problems with utilitarian aggregation that mere technical refinements cannot solve. The theory may be inherently unable to handle questions about who should exist. Despite persistent criticisms, utilitarianism remains enormously influential in academic philosophy and practical ethics. Its commitment to impartiality, concern for consequences, and evidence-based reasoning attracts many thoughtful people. The theory provides systematic framework for thinking about difficult moral questions. Even critics acknowledge that consequentialist considerations constitute an important part of moral reasoning. The debate continues about whether utilitarianism captures the whole truth or merely part of it. Understanding utilitarianism requires seeing past common misconceptions to grasp the theory's actual commitments and structure. It demands much more than crude cost-benefit calculation or selfish pursuit of advantage. Sophisticated versions address many standard objections through theoretical refinements and clarifications. Yet fundamental tensions remain between utilitarian principles and deeply held moral convictions. These tensions reveal important features of moral thought that any adequate theory must accommodate. The historical development from Bentham through Mill to contemporary variants shows utilitarianism's remarkable adaptability. Each generation of utilitarians has refined the theory in response to criticisms and new philosophical challenges. This evolution demonstrates both the theory's fertility and its core difficulties. Whether utilitarianism can ultimately succeed as comprehensive moral theory remains contested. But its influence on how we think about ethics, policy, and human welfare continues unabated.